There's 4 basic ingredients in beer, and barley malt is one of them. Brett, where does Urban Artifact get their malt?
Well, Mike, that's a great question because I thought you were going to ask me what the other 3 ingredients in beer were, and I was prepared to say flesh, blood, and bone.
That one comes out in October.
But when I'm buying my malt, I buy from Malt Europe because they make the best quality malt at the best possible price. Some of the best breweries in the world use Malt Europe, and I am proud to say that Urban Artifact is one of those breweries.
Do you have to be a commercial brewery to use Malt Europe malt?
You don't. You can head down to your local homebrew store and you can find a wide selection of Malt Europe malts there. So if you're a pro brewer or a home brewer alike, get the best value, the best product at the best price. Get Malt Europe.
And they support us. So Prost.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast. My name is Brett Coleman Baker, and I am here with the one and only Michael Morgan. Mike, how the hell are you?
Good. You know, we've never done that on camera. We've never done the actual podcast on camera.
That felt pretty good.
Yeah, sure.
And for those of you who are listening to the podcast, you can check out all the video content on our Brew Skies YouTube channel. So we got a bunch of other stuff there. We do a weekly show, yada, yada, yada. But we're not here to talk about that today. We're here to introduce the episode that we're probably most excited about, have been most excited about, Jim Koch.
Certainly a lot of fun. And it's actually 3 parts. So in previous episodes, we have mentioned Jim Koch and the fact that we were stalking him. And, you know, if you've been listening to this podcast up to this point, or if you haven't, you just tuned in, then start at the beginning because we have been lucky enough to interview the real rock stars of the early days of craft brewing. And that's something that we're going to be continuing to do this year as we move through more episodes, you know, going more into the 90s. But one of the really early and incredibly influential people that we wanted to talk to from the beginning. I mean, we knew we needed to talk to Jim Koch. And our producer, Dan, has had excellent success with getting a hold of a lot of these people that we never thought we'd reach. You know, Ken Grossman from Sierra Nevada and Fritz Maytag from the now deceased Anchor Brewing Company and Charlie Papazian and on. But we couldn't reach Jim Koch. So we just kept striking out, and I happened to be at Arnold's Bar and Grill one Saturday afternoon getting a buzz on the head, and which everyone will find shocking.
They do haircuts at Arnold's?
Yeah. Yeah, and I have so much of it that I need. So I was there at the bar, and the guy next to me at this bar, a stranger, he makes some statement about Little Kings or something that was factually incorrect, that, like, you know, Sam Adams makes Little Kings now or something. And so I engaged him, you know, like, yeah, I don't think they make Little Kings, but something, and this started a beer conversation, and I decided to start boring this guy with the podcast that we do. And in the course of just talking about beer for a little bit, I brought up how we'd been stalking Jim Koch and could never get a hold of him. And so this guy, this random stranger at the bar, says, well, he happens to be a good friend of mine. Would you like me to introduce you to him? And I'm like, hell yeah, I would. So I got his information on a bar napkin, and I reached out to him, and I emailed him, and then he didn't get back for a long time, and I followed up, and he didn't get back, and I figured it was all just bullshit. And then eventually he did, and he said, Jim's coming in town for a wedding, but you're gonna have to interview him during this one window of time if you wanted to come in to the studio. And that's how we wound up getting him into the Brew Skies studio to do an actual live interview.
And if you're not familiar with who Jim Koch is, he is the founder of Boston Beer, which is the makers of Sam Adams, among several other brands. He is one of the original architects architects of craft beer,
Yeah.
which we're going to get into. I mean, he and his brand have done more for craft beer than largely every single other brewery, which you guys will explore more.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, given his timing with the story and him coming in for the wedding, I wasn't around. So Mike had to take this one solo, which is a big time bummer for myself personally. Yeah. I was also at a wedding just out of country. So
in Brazil with a lot of very, scantily clad people, I think. In the wedding party, I think, even.
I'm sure it might have come off during the wedding. That's a different story for another time. So this 3-part episode, we're going to cover the early days of craft, him getting started, the hurdles they had there, what it was like to start a business, a public business, raise money and all that fun stuff. Yeah. We're going to get into part 2, which is the 90s and a certain battle.
A little war with a company you might have heard of called Anheuser-Busch. So we talked to Jim about what it's like to wake up one morning and discover that one of the richest companies in the world have literally declared you public enemy #1 and want you dead. So that's got to feel pretty cool.
Yeah, terrifying, but in hindsight, pretty awesome. And then the final episode, we talk about what we're going to call Jim the Savior, and that he saved a lot of breweries back in the day when there was hop crises. He's helped build and save the craft beer industry twice over, and he really helps us with a new appreciation for a style.
New England IPAs, which we love to shit on, and that's probably not going to stop. But I will say that Jim gave us a much better appreciation for those styles, why he likes them, why he thinks they are a very innovative aspect of craft beer and a good example of how good beer continues to evolve. So all of it is fantastic. I mean, those are the little tidbits of overviews. This interview, the whole thing, his story is incredibly fascinating. So I think you guys are going to dig it. Hope you enjoy it. Jim Koch, cheers. Thanks. Cheers. Thanks for joining me.
It's nice having a beer with you.
Yeah, and a delicious one at that.
Thank you.
So you've been making delicious beers for quite a long time, but you started in 1984. You put together the business model to do Boston beer, to start to make Sam Adams. And that begins, part of that, it's in your blood. Beer's in your blood.
About a .06.
Yeah.
So I'm legal. We are not broadcasting under the influence here.
Well, one of us, perhaps. But you are a fifth-generation brewer, sixth-generation brewer, the oldest brewing family by generation in America. Is that right?
Yes.
So that...
The Yinglings have caught up with us.
Oh, damn those people.
Yeah, it's okay. They're all good people.
Yeah, I hear good things about the Yinglings, actually, and they've been making good beer for a long time.
Yep.
But this very long history, was the first brewer in your family Louis Koch? Is that right?
It was actually his father who
Okay.
came here from Germany.
Wow.
Who's lost in history, but it was Louis, then a whole string of Charles J's. There was Charles Jerome, there was Charles Joseph, there was Charles Joseph Jr., I'm Charles James, my son is Charles James Jr., and my grandson is Charles Joseph. So there's a lot of CJs.
That's very impressive. Where did they start to brew?
Well, my great-great-great-grandfather came over from Germany as a brewer.
What part?
In the northern part. I think it's, I'm not that deep into the history. I think it's like Amrhein or Arnheim. My sister went all the way back to the village where my family came from, and actually they found a family crest, which looked
Very
like
cool.
3 nuts hanging on a branch. So it was almost risque. So we've never used that.
So in America, where did the Koch start to brew?
In St. Louis, they, settled in the Midwest. I mean, and St. Louis was, of course, a very, very German town, and the three German centers of brewing in the United States were St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Milwaukee, and they settled in an area called Soulard in the western part of St. Louis, and started a brewery there in, it looks like, the 1840s, maybe 1850s.
Very early for that part of the country in particular.
Yeah, exactly. And they actually had a brewery that was like a third the size, a half the size in, I think, the 1860 census of another nearby brewery. It was like 4 blocks away, that was started by another German immigrant, Eberhard Anhauser, whose daughter, of course, married Adolphus Busch, and the rest is history. And I guess there wasn't room in that neighborhood for more than one, and it wasn't us.
Well, your family came close in the 1840s, but there's still time, Jim.
How you think we'll catch him?
I think you might catch him.
Well, yeah, maybe. At least we're still American, and they're a subsidiary of
Right.
Intergalactic Brewing Corporation,
exactly.
run by very
Yeah,
smart
I mean, by that
Brazilians.
regard, you are now America's largest brewery, correct?
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah,
That-
it is crazy.
It's not like we got there by being so huge. It's everybody else just dropped out.
Yeah, sold out.
Yeah, it's
So-
a little bit crazy.
So when you decide to start a brewery in about 1984, put the business plan together, at that period of time, to kind of put that in context nationally, Fritz Maytag had been doing his thing since the mid-'60s, but Anchor seems a little bit different. You've got Jack McAuliffe being the first guy to like get a new brewery license and build a brewery by hand in 76. You've got Grossman doing Sierra Nevada in 79. You've got Colorado Brewery in 79.
Oh, Boulder.
Or Boulder
Beer.
Correct.
Yep.
Buffalo Bills, Bill Owens starts kind of the first brew pub model in 83. So there are some people out there, but this concept of craft beer, it's still very new. And when you look at all those people, they had done, I mean, they wound up having varying degrees of success or not. But regardless of that, they all started out largely the same, which was, let's go out and find some old dairy equipment. Let's find somebody that can weld. We'll put it together in a garage somewhere, and we'll basically become a larger, glorified homebrew system, and we'll start to make beer that way. You still kind of started out. You started out as a young guy, and one that in a lot of ways was kind of a babe in the woods in the 80s, but also undeniably pretty damn savvy in terms of how your business plan differed from that. I mean, your model, the way you started brewing, was different from what guys like Jack McAuliffe was doing.
Yeah, and what I think distinguished me as a craft brewer at that time was, I was the only one of that whole group that had any brewing background, and that had access to and grew up with professional brewers, so actually knew how good beer is made consistently, which is a totally different animal than homebrewing.
Right.
And, scaling up homebrewing equipment and trying to brew quality beer consistently and put that out into, the wider world, outside of your basement and your refrigerator, into a world where maybe beer isn't always kept cold.
Right.
Maybe it's even in a bottle that gets put on a shelf. So I came from a background of, you've got to have quality. And, my dad was very insistent about that if your product isn't consistently good, you cannot build a customer base. And so when I looked at, what were the options, and my dad helped me with it. He went to, I think we visited Bill Newman's brewery in Albany, um, and and he came to a Great American Beer Festival with me, I think in 1984, maybe it was 85. And I remember him tasting the beers. My father he was big. He was like 6'3", 240, and was very German and speaking his mind. And he pissed off a couple of brewers. I think he said to one of them, I wouldn't put that in my enema bag. It was because we were tasting these infected beers. And Bill Newman, God love him, he was a pioneer, wonderful guy, really dedicated, passionate brewer. But the equipment you could get, then he had open fermenters. He was, he'd worked in Britain, and he had one of those, brew pub, Fox and Firkin type of systems that had just terrible standards of sanitation. You had open fermenters in the same room
all kinds of
where
shit
you have
falling into
a
it.
hammer mill, grinding your malt, literally. So there was malt dust floating around on top of his fermenters, and he couldn't figure out why his beer, regularly, even keg beer that he kept cold, why this stuff would turn to vinegar. And that was very common in craft beer. They had this marketing ethic that said, well, I'm cute, I'm local, I'm small, so it's okay if my beer sucks.
Right.
And, my father had run cute, local, small breweries out of brewmaster school, and he knew that you didn't have any chance of surviving if you were going to base this on a marketing mentality. So that was what distinguished Boston Beer Company is. This is not about marketing. This is not about being cute, small, and local and lovable if the beer sucks. So if you have to make a trade-off between a great marketing proposition and a consistently great beer, I bet on the consistently great beer. And that's what worked. And it wasn't very complicated. It was not, you didn't need any great business savvy to know that if you're giving people inferior and crappy products, you don't deserve to stay in business.
Yeah, and so at the end of the day, I think that when you look back at the success that you have had, it is traceable to having a good, consistent product from the beginning. And you did that by contract brewing initially.
Mm-hmm.
So contract brewing is basically, you are renting out somebody else's brewery.
Yep.
You're making the beer. You even
show up there at MASH at 4 a.m. Yep.
You even modified and made some additions to some of those breweries to make Sam Adams when you went from one originally in Pittsburgh, I think, to a couple other locations.
Yeah, they did not have the capability of doing a decoction mash, which the original recipe called for. And it's part of the flavor structure of Boston Lager to leave a set of sugars that are kind of too big for the yeast to easily ferment, but small enough to be tastable as a substantive sweetness. It's like trimaltose and maltodextrins, bigger sugars that have to be produced by basically taking the temperature of the mash from your protein rest in the 20s all the way through the saccharification range up to like 165 in 8 minutes or less. So We had to put in big pipes.
So it's complicated. You're taking part of the wort out and heating it up to a different temperature, and you're putting it back,
dropping it
and there's
into the
a
main-
strict time
Yes.
period from where you're doing it. So you couldn't have done that on a lot of those systems. I mean, even as much respect as I have for Sierra Nevada, and Sierra Nevada Pale is an excellent beer, but even, Grossman, very good brewer that he was, wouldn't have been capable of doing that in, his little garage brewery at the time.
Ken would have.
He could have figured
Ken
it
would
out.
have
He seems like
found a way.
he's really a really resourceful, smart guy.
Yeah,
Yes.
I believe he would, but his
So,
model
but yeah,
was
the
New
point,
Albion.
right? Yeah, I mean that's
Kind of
the
single malt,
point is it would have
single
been
hop, scaled up
Yes.
homebrewing. His model of the world was
Right.
let's scale up homebrewing.
Right.
Mine came from professional brewers who had long heritage, long tradition. Were willing to do sort of antique brewing methods. So there was just
Right.
a different. One is not better or worse. They were just different paradigms and different expectations about what you could do. I mean, I was like, we can find a way to make this beer, and we can make it in a place that has world-class standards of sanitation, that has, a full 3 or 4 person lab with a gas chromatograph, and can do all these analyses and can culture it and make sure everything's clean. That was how I knew what brewing could be, and that was different.
And that came, I guess one of my questions is how much of that came from you observing the problems with the craft brewers that had come before. And what I'm hearing from you is that it was some of that, but it was also more this family history. It's that you knew how good beer is made.
That's right. And, my dad looked at, what a craft brewer at that time looked like, and he's like, Jim, that's no way to make good beer. And, you can look at the history of who survived. Because you mentioned some people like, Bill Owens, who's a great guy, survived for a long time.
Very entertaining.
Totally wonderful guy. And, a world-class photographer. I mean, Yale had a retrospective of Bill's book Suburbia, which is a wonderful, visually ironic piece of 1970s Americana. It was really, that's a great, just the most subtly ironic book of visual images that I can recall. So these were really, really talented, capable
Smart
people. But when you look at all the original brewers, it's me and Ken, and that's it.
Right.
That's it. And Ken always made good beer. He just always made good beer, and he didn't try to push beyond the limits of what he could make and keep good. And good is not defined by what the beer tastes like when you made it, when it leaves the brewery. That doesn't matter. It's defined by what does it taste like when the consumer gets it. And so we pioneered things that are kind of a little geeky. We were the first brewer to put consumer legible freshness dating.
Yeah, very
on beer.
important.
Yeah, back then when I started, the beer had a code on it, and people even today, when the beer has gone stale, brewers don't use that term. It's called out of code.
Yes.
Because there was
a lot of breweries still do that. They have this fewer and fewer of them, but there are still breweries that use indecipherable codes.
Well, that's exactly right. And the code when I started was a pattern of notches on the side of the label. So breweries had the ability to notch the label, but they would notch it with this pattern, and you needed a code card. And there was a little area of it, like for the year, and then there was another area for the day of the month, and you had a set of codes in there. One was there was a 1 and a 2 and a 4 and an 8, and I think a 16, and was there a 32? No, I think there wasn't, because you could
For
make
clearly
31.
the 32nd month of the year.
Yeah, well, day of the month. No, so you made it with a 16 and an 8 and a 4 and a 2 and
Okay.
that kind of
right.
thing. So it was even more complicated than reading an inkjet. You had, and every brewer had their own code card. So unless you had the code card for that brewer, it was like, the enigma trying to figure out people's codes. So it was really hidden from everybody. And I said, why would you want to do that? I mean, if your beer is stale, you want the consumer to know that, so they won't buy it and they won't have a bad experience with your beer. And that was,
Well,
I
if
got
you're
a lot of
making
grief
Natty
for that.
Light, who cares, I guess. But when
Natty Light, if it's 6 months old,
it's still not
it's
going to
not
taste what it's
Natty
supposed
Light.
to taste like.
That's right.
But when you pick up Sam Adams today, I've got one in my hand right now, and quite delicious. But you have on the side of it in English decipherable date code.
Yes, drink
Enjoy
before
by
month
this
notched.
date.
That's right.
So some of the big breweries, Anheuser-Busch, took that up later on. But that starts with you. That starts with Sam Adams.
Yes, and that was the sort of distinguishing feature of Sam Adams and Boston Lager, is that you could become brand loyal because I would fulfill the pledge to you that if it's got my brand on it, you can expect a great beer experience every time, and you're not going to be disappointed.
Quality beer, consistent beer, fresh beer.
Yeah.
And a Reinheitsgebot pure beer.
Yep.
You were the first beer to be distributed in Germany, is that right?
Yes, we were the first beer to pass the Reinheitsgebot and be sold in Germany, which was,
Very nice.
to me, that was just very cool.
Yeah,
because
that is very cool.
as someone who came from a very old family of American brewers, I knew that Americans could make great beer, and the Americans did make great beer back in the 1800s. Budweiser used to be 25 bitterness units. And it was a great beer, and the Blue Ribbon for Pabst, that was for genuine quality. But Americans, slowly lightened up the beer, and it started before Prohibition, and then took off after Prohibition. And my dad said it was, and in the Second World War, the beer was all watered down. There wasn't enough barley. They were throwing lots of corn in it, and the beer was almost water white in terms of color. And the beer drinkers got used to it, and the brewers discovered, well, wow, this is a great idea. It costs less money to make.
Right.
People pay the same for it, and they drink more of it. What's not to like?
So quality beer has been at the core of what you do from the beginning. And I get the impression that there is nothing that could have been said to you to piss Jim Koch off more in the late 80s or early 90s than, Jim, you do fantastic marketing. Because you still, I think, make, this distinction between marketing and sales.
Yes.
And there's a fantastic quote, a metaphor that you've used a few times.
Yes, I have.
of the distinction between marketing and sales. But that difference, it really fascinates me when I look at the 80s, because I want to read a couple of statistics here. Between 1984 and 1990, the percentage of the national marketplace that Anheuser-Busch, Miller, and Coors took up went from 64% to 81%, just between 1984 and 1990. Now, that started to kill off a lot of regional breweries. When you look here locally, Hootapole Shaneling was our biggest and wound up being our last regional brewery here in Greater Cincinnati, Hudepole Schaenlein, just from 1989 to 1992, went from controlling 50% of the Cincinnati regional market to 10%. So they got their asses kicked. And of that, then Anheuser-Busch controlled 43% of the regional Cincinnati market. You know, this market that had its own very proud, long brewing heritage and tradition.
Absolutely.
But in that same period of time, Sam Adams goes from Boston Beer as a company, but Sam Adams goes from 115,000 barrels of beer annually in 33 different states to 275,000 barrels a year with a 49 state distribution.
Yeah, we got all the way up to 0.1%.
Of
I was really happy about that. It was like,
That's
someday
amazing.
we're going to be 0.2%. I can double. I think I remember telling somebody at Anheuser-Busch, you know, I can do something you guys can't do with your 50% market share. And she, what can't we do? And I said, well, I can double.
True. But even though you were still tiny compared to Anheuser-Busch, Coors, Miller.
Even Stroh's and Pabst and Heilmann at that time.
Yeah. You were growing exponentially, at least from a percentage standpoint, what you were doing, at the same time that regionals were being killed off like a slasher movie.
Yep.
And those regionals were being killed off. The accepted wisdom is that they died because they were just outspent and outfoxed on advertising. You know, tastes great, less filling, Spuds McKenzie, a lot of really beautiful women, very scantily clad in 80s, late 70s beer
But
commercials.
Stroh's had the dog.
Stroh's had a dog.
Alex, I hope you're drinking your water.
Exactly. But not only could you not compete with that from an advertising dollar standpoint, you didn't even, I mean, you thought fuck the concept of it. You know, you're about a direct kind of connection with the consumer. But why did that work? I mean, why was it that regionals with their local, people in a city like Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, they had these connections to these regional brands, you know, Old Town, Iron City, Hudepole, but they started to give those connections up in exchange for the coolness factor they were told you had if you drank a Bud Light or a Miller Lite. Why does that differ from what you were doing? How did you start to succeed so well as those regionals started to be slaughtered?
You know, I had to explain this to my father. When I told him I was going to leave my job, I was a manufacturing consultant for 7 years, and I was going to start a small brewery. And he did not, again, mince words and said, Jim, you've done some really stupid things in your life, but this is the dumbest effing thing you've ever told me. And because he was, like all of us, we tend to get imprisoned in our matrix, our paradigm, if you like that term, which I do. And he was imprisoned in that paradigm, which is beer is a mass-produced and mass-marketed product. And therefore, as a small brewer, you don't have a chance. And he ran breweries like that.
Yeah.
You know, and he made Boston Lager at a brewery that he ran in Minster, Ohio, the Wooden Shoe Brewery.
Wow.
Back in the 1950, I think.
Wow.
The date is on his notes, which is what I used to make Boston Lager, yeah, obviously it was a paradigm-breaking beer. And so the owner found out he'd made it. The owner tasted it and said, Charlie, this is not what people want. People want water that will hold a head. So that's what you need to make. Dump this. And he didn't dump it. He kegged one keg and drank it with his friends. But dump this and make water that will hold a head. And he got out of brewmaster school in 1948. There were 1,000 breweries in the United States then. And by the time I started Boston Beer, that 1,000 was down to like 40.
Right.
And so, 96% of the breweries that existed had gone out of business because they were all trying to compete with Bud Miller and Coors on their terms, in their paradigm of what beer should be. And this was not that hard. It was like
so the only thing that the only thing that differentiated them was, in fact, labels and marketing and advertising. That the beer was basically the same.
That's right. That's basically
so you
some of the
pulled
really
ahead
small regionals, the 25,000 barrel breweries. I mean, if you see pictures of Wooden Shoe Brewery in 1950, it's pretty primitive. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. You're going in there every year and repitching the tanks with tar? Oh, okay. Not only who wants to do that in January, when it's 38 degrees in there and 100% humidity, but then crawl into a tank, and with a blowtorch and repitch the thing. But it's not great. I mean, you're better off with stainless steel. So he finally, when I told him, look, Dad, trying to compete with them is like trying to compete, opening a restaurant and saying, I'm going to compete with McDonald's. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
Even if your beer is just as good as, or your burgers are just as good as McDonald's, you're not going to be noticeably superior, and you're not going to change the competitive advantages and consumer habits. I'm going to do something different. I am going to make a noticeably, dramatically, almost shockingly different beer. Better is in the eye of the beholder, but it is going to be rich, full-flavored, unique. It's not going to look, smell, or taste like any beer that a beer drinker in 1984 has ever had. And I'm going to open a gourmet restaurant. And it doesn't matter that there's a Burger King on this corner and a McDonald's over here and a Taco Bell.
You're the steak option for the burger.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And yes, I'm not going to get to their size. That's okay. I mean, who is? But I'm going to be able to make a living. And that's when the light went on for him. And then... I mean, and there's another.
And he thought that you might not be moving back into the house.
Well, to be totally honest, I would love to tell you, I took out a third mortgage and I bet everything on this. And if I didn't make it, I would have been homeless and destitute. I mean, to be completely honest, I was like, look, I'm going to be able to feed my family. And actually, my mentor at BCG at that time was at General Electric. And I talked to him about it. And he said, Jim, you may think like you're taking a risk here. You're not really taking a risk because, frankly, I would sooner hire you with 2 years of a failed entrepreneurship on your resume than 2 more years at BCG. So, this is like rock climbing.
With a Harvard business degree behind that.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Yeah,
I wasn't going to go homeless.
Yeah.
I was climbing with a rope.
Yeah.
This was not free soloing up Yosemite. I was in good shape.
You were, unlike myself, smart enough to drop out of law school.
So. No, I wasn't. I'm like, this is how stupid I am. Mike, I finished. I got the friggin' degree.
Oh, did you really?
I
thought you dropped. I thought you dropped out.
Well, I did drop out, but then I came back. I dropped out of business school too.
Damn it!
I had the wonderful experience of going to my 5th-year business school reunion, and people ask me, "So, Jim, what are you doing now?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually graduating next week. I'm pretty proud of that." I got the degree. I never took the bar. I went into the bar, but I never passed it.
It is a good education. The practice of law is a terrible
thing to do. It's not worth 3 years.
But
I'll take those 3 years back.
Yeah, fair enough.
The Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast is a production of Brew Skies Limited. This episode was edited by Dan Fennessy, who is also our executive producer. This podcast was engineered by Adam Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.